Perfect. So I think we should just start. So let me first of all welcome everybody to this session of the EMO Latin American Caribbean Colloquium Series. We're going to be having two guest speakers today, which is great for having a discussion and a conversation. And so let me introduce them first. Joining us today is Professor Alejandra Echeverri Ochoa. She's an assistant professor at the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management at UC Berkeley. And her research is in the intersection of biological surveys and quantitative experiments to understand how humans relate to nature. She's going to tell us about how, in the recent years, different policies have been implemented in Colombia to manage both the biological and the cultural diversity. And we're really glad to have her here. So thank you so much, Professor Echeverri, for joining us. Also joining in for the panel discussion, we're going to have Sandra Perdomo Medina. She's the Director of International Affairs, Policy and Cooperation from the Alexander von Humboldt Biological Resources Research Institute of Colombia. Sandra has vast experience in public policy design, implementation, and evaluation, and she has been a public policy lecturer for the last 7 years. And if I'm not mistaken, she joined the Alexander von Humboldt Biological Resources Research Institute about 4 years ago, and she's been on the front lines of public policy design and implementation, so she can give us more of a practical perspective and insight on the challenges that we're going to be discussing through the presentation. Before giving the floor to Professor Echeverri, let me just give a quick context about the colloquium series. What we're doing here, we're trying to create a broader effort to make for more conversations about the challenges that are currently present in the Latin American and Caribbean region. And in particular, we had a first session in August on public health and environmental risk factors in Mexico. Now we're going to be discussing biodiversity policies in Colombia. And then the EMO conference is going to be taking place in San Luis de Potosí. This is going to happen between the 29th and 31st of October. And we hope that these conversations can create a longer-term engagement and longer-term discussions between people in academia that are interested in the working groups that EMO has, but also policymakers and practitioners who might benefit from the tools and methods that people are developing across different research and working groups. One final thing that I want to do before we move into the presentation is just give a big shout out to all the people that have made this possible. In particular, I want to give a shout out to our moderators, Hannah and Ivan. They are both PhD students. Hannah is at USC and Ivan is at Stanford. But more importantly, they are both co-organizing the Environment Working Group, which is starting this semester. So in case you haven't heard about that and you're interested about these type of topics and discussions, feel free to reach out to them. I'm sure that they will be more than happy to hear from you and to stay in touch. And then also I want to give a big thanks to Paula and Emilia, who have helped us co-organize the session, secure the speakers. Paula is a PhD student at Harvard. She's also the co-founder of the Centro de Analítica para Políticas Públicas, with whom we are co-organizing the session. And Emilia is a student in Universidad de los Andes. She looks at government and public affairs. And many, many thanks for all your help. We've also had special support from Kristen and Mackenzie from the working group of conversation with practitioners who have helped us prepare questions for the panel discussion, as well as our directors, Sandro, Rea, Charles, and Lily, who have been greatly supportive of the initiative. And so once again, thank you to all who have been part of organizing this session. And now, without further ado, I'm just going to give the floor to Professora Echeverri. Feel free to share your screen and just take it away whenever you're ready. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm just going to share my screen right now. And please let me know if you see the full screen, not my notes. Good. Yeah, so thank you for hosting me. My name is Alejandra Echeverri, and I'm an assistant professor of conservation science at UC Berkeley. And my talk today is called Policy Mixes for Biodiversity Governance, Governing Colombian Biocultural Diversity at the Nexus of Sectoral Policies. First, I want to acknowledge that I am calling today from Huichin, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone peoples. And I want to acknowledge that I celebrate all indigenous peoples and local communities that stand strong in our planet to preserve their territories, their landscapes and seascapes, and their culture. So many of you know, and I don't have to say this to everybody, but that people are changing the environment, right? Like whether by changing the climate, by creating really sad deforestation patterns. We have heard this narrative over and over that people are inherently bad for the environment. And as part of the global change, we have seen two intertwined crises. There's the cultural loss and biodiversity loss are consequences of global changes. And we see this pretty much every day across the world, especially in Latin America, where indigenous peoples, local communities continue to say, hey, you're destroying our territories. But very few people think that people are a key part of the solution of these problems, right? Whether it's by volunteering to clean up beaches, by motivating tourists to go bird watching and to learn about and care about the places. I think that a lot of my work thinks not only on the human impact on biodiversity and cultural diversity, but also the positive impact that we could have. So if we think about these two drivers of global change, say, take a Central American forest, land use change, like lots of deforestation happening, converting these beautiful rainforests into cattle ranching areas, for example. And if we mix it together with climate change, such as climate drying, we have seen that, okay, yes, we lose species, for example, rainforest species that depend on those forests to also have the rain, like the resplendent quetzal. And we lose biodiversity that way with habitat loss and climate change. But we don't not just lose the birds themselves or the species. I'm an ornithologist, so a lot of the talk today will be about birds. But if we think about the quetzal, for example, it is also a god for the Mayas, and it's been in the Mayan mythology for years. And it's also in the flag of Guatemala, and it's the currency of Guatemala. So we not only lose the species, we can also lose culture and who we are as people. And so in this talk, I'll seek to answer two main questions. I think a lot about the relationship between people and biodiversity by thinking that these relationships are bidirectional. We can have both positive and negative impacts on biodiversity, and biodiversity can have both positive and negative impacts on us. So I study today, for the purpose of this talk, I'll present on how is biodiversity governed in a megadiverse country like Colombia, and how can, and I say this in theory, protect biocultural diversity through key economic sectors. So I know many of you come from more like the government side of things, lawyers, economists, so I'll start very basic. What is biodiversity? So in the policy definition by the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, we say it's the variety of life on Earth and the natural patterns in forms. But as biologists, we do not have one single definition. When we think of biodiversity, we think of different levels. We think of, okay, what is the genetic diversity within a species? Think of the corn and all the varieties it creates. What are populations? So different groups of individuals of the same species separated by space. What are the species themselves? And that's the one that we most commonly see in law and policy, such as Species Endangered Species Act and so on and so forth. But then a group of species interacting with each other in a given ecosystem, those are communities that we also study. And so as an ecologist, I am actually a community ecologist. I study birds in, say, the forest. And then we have ecosystems themselves that are the combination of biotic and abiotic factors. So an ecosystem is not just all the living organisms, but also, say, the rocks and geological formations. And all these levels are found in policy of biodiversity. Another thing to consider is how the evolution of conservation paradigms has changed through time. And this is a beautiful article by Georgina Mays. And it's like, it mentions that through the policy, we've seen different series of thinking about conservation. So we started with the paradigm of nature for itself, with key ideas on wilderness, protected areas, and that's how conservation started. Then we had a narrative of nature despite people in the 80s thinking a lot about this predominant narrative that people are bad for the environment by creating pollution, overexploitation, hunting. Then in the 2000s, we started to see a paradigm that is more rooted in the combination of ecology and economics with ecosystems, ecosystem services, the benefits that nature provide to people and how to internalize that in economic models. In the 2000s, we started to think more about people and nature, social ecological systems, feedback loops. And, this is from 2003. So I think the one we're in now, of the 220 and onwards, is more about relational values, environmental justice, indigenous peoples and local communities, and thinking about nature as culture. And so I would say that this is kind of one of the paradigms that we're talking about today. But I want to mention that all of these paradigms are still very common to find in policy. Like, we still have protected areas, we have payments for ecosystem services, but it's important to keep in mind that all of these are different ways of thinking about conservation. So how do we govern biodiversity? So this is from one of the articles I did as a postdoc when I was at Stanford with Professor Eric Lambin and Professor Gretchen Daly. I worked on this research for Colombia, so I'll present the results today. But the first thing to think about is, like, what are the policy instruments? So for conservation, we have command and control policies, or policies that basically tell you what you can and cannot do, and are regulatory frameworks, especially on land use. So we have, for example, national parks fit in this category. We have instruments like information and networking, for example, the IUCN Red List, which is an information instrument that then governments can use to dictate which species will become endangered, for example. We have standard commitments and pledges, because not all policies are government-led. A lot of them are led by private sector certification standards like Rainforest Alliance, or the combination of like NGO, private sector, and government. Then we have an instrument of framework policies, or the ones that set the agendas. Many of you are familiar with this one, like the Sustainable Development Goals. And then we have financing instruments. And this is all the stuff that we would think of, like taxes, bonds, and so on. And so what is a policy mix as a concept? And I'm borrowing this definition by Professors Irene Ring and Christoph Schroeter-Schlack. And they say that a policy mix is a combination of policy instruments which has evolved to influence the quality and quantity of biodiversity conservation and ecosystem service provision in public and private sectors. So this is the theoretical framework or concept that I use for this paper. So in recent years, we've been seeing a proliferation of biodiversity policy instruments at all governance scales. I think maybe you guys are even more familiar with this than I am, but we've been seeing a lot coming from the United Nations on mainstreaming biodiversity in economic productive sectors. We see sustainable development goals tackling biodiversity directly, like the Goal 15 on life on land. We are about to have the COP16 in Colombia in a couple of months, which will be focusing a lot on the private sector enrollment and the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And individual countries continue to create all sorts of instruments like compensation plans for biodiversity loss. And so we've been seeing a proliferation of these instruments, but I wanted to study Colombia as a case study. Why? Well, first, I'm Colombian, so I was actually familiar with the case study already, but also because biodiversity in Colombia is exuberant. It is one of the most megadiverse countries in the world. And so for biological reasons, like, how is Colombia governing all its biodiversity, right? but not just for biodiversity reasons, like Colombian biodiversity leaders. We can see them everywhere. Like the former president of the IPBES is Colombian, Ana Maria Hernandez. We have many leaders that are Colombian in important institutions at the international scale. We have the Inter-American Development Bank. Dr. Juan Pablo Onilla, for example, works as a civil engineer, but leading the whole environmental agenda of the bank. And we have Colombian leaders advising, for example, Jeff Bezos where to invest, IUCN policies, how to determine protected areas. So we do have lots of Colombians in governance, right, at all levels. But as you'll learn today, the local domestic policy interacts with the international one. So having Colombians both locally and internationally working on this makes it a strong case study to analyze. And this is a figure from Ivan's paper. So thank you, Ivan. You have no idea how important your research is for mine. But Colombia is also interesting for its land tenure and governance. So this is from Ivan's paper, but here you can see in blue the areas of Colombia, continental Colombia, that are indigenous reserves, in brown, the ones that are declared as Afro-Colombian territories, and in green, the protected areas. So we also have different jurisdictions and in thinking about protection. So how is biodiversity governed in Colombia? My questions for this research are, first, what is the composition of today's biodiversity policy mix? Second, how has it evolved over time? Third, how do policies differ among actors and ecosystems in terms of themes and instruments? And how does the policy mix address the primary threats to biodiversity? So how did I do this? I collected data, so I am not a lawyer or an economist, so I did it the way I would as a biologist. Gather information, collect, analyze in like with ecological methods. So first, Colombia regional governance is organized by these CIRAP regions of the Caribbean, Orinoquia, Amazon, Pacific. So that's how like the subnational policies are structured, but we have levels of international policies, national, so these ones that I call regional, and then municipal, right? And so first I looked at the policies that were issued between the first one, which was 1959 to 2008 when I was working on this. I looked at different governance scales, international, national, regional, departmental, and municipal. I only included terrestrial ecosystems. So I included coastal ecosystems like mangroves, but excluded marine policies. And I focused on the actors. So I included policies that were issued by international organizations like the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, by the government of Colombia, by the departamentos, by indigenous peoples and local communities, and by the major cities in the country. So how did I do this? First, it was content analysis. I read national policies from the Environment Ministry website. I collected information from the municipal, departmental, and private sector policies. Then I did qualitative analysis to code each policy of who's the lead actor, what is the policy instrument, and that one, 5 co-authors coded, is this financing, is this command and control, and so on. And we also coded the policy goals. What is this policy trying to do? What is the scale of biodiversity? Is it tackling genetic communities, ecosystems? What is the conservation paradigm? So are they doing preservation, sustainable use? And what are the themes? Is this a policy that is governing climate change and biodiversity, or food and biodiversity, and so on? And then I did a quantitative analysis, mostly counting frequencies and doing functional diversity metrics like I do for my ecological work. And so what is the composition of today's policy mix? And this is, I'm gonna put it all here, but I won't explain everything in detail. First, we learned that of the 189 policies that I found, 98 of them do not specify what is it about biodiversity that they're governing. 96 of them say that it's ecosystems. So we see a lot of, like, it lacks specificity in the biological terms. Of the paradigms, we see that the predominant one is the sustainable use of biodiversity. So using biodiversity for something else, like food or trade or whatever. Of the main instrument, we see that is command and control is the one that is being used the most. But as you can see, the diversity, their policy instruments are all present in this policy mix, and the actors are using all of them that are available to them. We see a very strong role for the central government. So the central government still is in control of most of the policy mix issuing these policies. But the private sector is also kind of starting to have more and more policy instruments. The scale also, most of them were national, but we see a lot of international policies. And in terms of ecosystems, most of them weren't specified. So it just says we're governing biodiversity like this, right? But it doesn't say what. But for the specified ones, we see that forests are the ones that are the main focus, and agroecosystems. So how has it changed over time? This you can see the policy instruments, and this is a cumulative frequency of like when these instruments were introduced. So it's just adding over time. So first thing you can see is that here the 5 colors are the different policy instruments, and you see that around the 2000 there's been like a spike in all kinds of policies. So we do see that proliferation happening, but we see that the command and control policies have and continue to be the main one. But for example, that information and networking is being very important in the last, say, decade, right? And if you look at the different policies and what they're focusing on, so like what theme or goal they're tackling. So I found, like, I think I have 16 or something like that, different themes here. So you can see that protected areas, so these are kind of histograms. So the further out here, that's the number of policies. So you see that about 55 or 50 policies are still protected areas. So that remains the cornerstone of our biodiversity policy, right? But the key nexus, the main one, is with climate change and with poverty. So that's what we're seeing, how Colombia is governing. But we also see that lots of stuff is being governed together with biodiversity, from peace forests to indigenous lands, through mining, invasive species. So lots of stuff happening in this policy mix. Another interesting thing to think about is that if you look at the growth between the different periods of time, we see that, for example, between the 2014 and 2020, that's where most protected areas legislation happened here. And I will say that because Colombia issues like laws that then supersede other laws, I got the last version of that law. So that's why if you think, oh no, Ale, lots of parks were established before that, true, but I'm just working on the ones that were amended, right? Just to see the growth of the recent trend. But for example, water started to become more and more important in the last few years. So you see how the evolution of this policy mix is kind of dependent, and say mining and tourism are growing, but are still not the most important sectors, but are growing in the last 5 years for biodiversity governance. So how do they differ across instruments, ecosystems, and actors? So we see that the Colombian government mostly issues command and control policies, while, say, municipalities mostly issue framework policies. We see that internationally, there's a lot of standards, commitments, and pledges happening. And we see that by ecosystems, for example, forests have a very broad range of governance and policy instruments, but say wetlands, we see comparatively fewer policies and more dominance of some instruments. So in general, we see that this is a very rich and diverse policy mix, right? And so is it addressing the primary threats to biodiversity? Here I use the threats that the IPBES regional assessment has for all the Americas. So let me explain this. So this would be for all South America. I took these percentages. So here I have the percentages in the C column. For South America, we say that agriculture and aquaculture are threatening biodiversity by 25%. But if you think of these Sankey diagrams as kind of how many command and control policies are addressing that threat, we see, for example, that for agriculture and aquaculture, Colombia has less policies going to that threat compared to how that threat is perceived for the region, right? But we see, for example, that a lot of the policies are tackling the natural system modification. So a lot of them are thinking about deforestation, conversion of forests to, say, oil palm, this sort of stuff. And we see that overall, this policy mix is very centralized by the national government, but we also found that enough policies are addressing all the threats. Like we didn't get any zeros, right? Very few policies on invasive species. But this might also be because I didn't include the marine policies. But we see that this supply and demand kind of happening in this policy mix. So take-home messages. It's a rich policy mix. There's a balanced policy mix where policymakers are using the portfolio of instruments. It remains mostly unspecified with 64% not mentioning biodiversity scale, so they just say biodiversity. We see an increased social ecological approach to conservation, so we do see that changes in conservation paradigms, and we see a recent diversification of policy actors, but still a very large role by the central government. And we do have evidence to suggest that there's some equilibrium between policy demand and supply because actors have identified a role for themselves. So now I'm going to answer the second question, which is how can, in theory, we protect biocultural diversity through key economic sectors? And here, as I showed you, biodiversity is going through many sectors, including tourism, agriculture, forestry. In theory, tourism provides win-win solutions for biodiversity conservation and for rural development. But biodiversity alone is not sufficient, right, to drive the tourism sector. We just need also hotels and so on, right, to bring tourists to a location. So across the world, we see that tourism contributes 10% of the global GDP, with nature-based tourism being its fastest growing sector. The most visited places are those that bring together cultural heritage and natural heritage. So we have, for example, the Carnival of Rio de Janeiro, where you can see it's a music festival, but also has lots of biodiversity. Places like Machu Picchu, places like the Giza pyramids, where they're not just biodiversity places, right? And according to some economic research and some research coming from the bank, especially the Inter-American Development Bank, the tourism has win-win approaches for biocultural conservation and rural development. So I told you that we're going to be focusing on tourism, and in 60 years of biodiversity governance, I found 16 active policies that govern biodiversity in the tourism sector, with a growing trend for the last 10 years. So to answer that question, first we have to answer other questions. So are cultural diversity and biodiversity correlated? For example, if so, where? And can biocultural diversity be mainstream in the tourism sector? If so, how? So Colombia is not just a good case study for biodiversity, it's also home to over 170 ethnic groups, indigenous peoples, Afro-Colombian peoples, campesinos. We have lots of cultural diversity, and we have places like in Nariño, for example, where we have the music festival of the Festival de Blancos y Negros in areas very close to an endemic hotspot like the Páramo of El Fraile, right? So here, I'm also thinking a lot about the current vision for the government, the current president, has the national development plan called Colombia Potencia Mundial de la Vida, like World Power of Life. And this plan focuses a lot on bird watching tourism, protecting endemic species, having co-management with indigenous peoples and local communities. And as of July this year, Colombia's Law 2373 declared Colombia the country of the birds because they want to project themselves as bird watching central location. And so here, I put together a working group with all sorts of colleagues to analyze are biodiversity and cultural diversity correlated? If so, where? This is the working group I brought to Stanford University. We are ornithologists. We study fishes, we study mammals, and then we also have musicians, anthropologists working on ethnomusicology, ethnography. And we've been trying to do this work, which is, I have a preprint available, but it's in revision right now. First, we thought, okay, how do we quantify and map and spatialize biocultural diversity? So we tried to get information that was readily available of endemic music, sense of place, people like museums, music festivals, indigenous and Afro-Colombian territories, and places designated by UNESCO as World Heritage and Intangible Cultural Heritage Sites. And then a lot of us are biologists, so we had all the vertebrates mapped on this. And because I have an ethnomusicologist working with me, here's the endemic music playlist. If you want to take a screenshot for Spotify, he put together lots of songs that are in kind of fitting our maps, but you won't see the songs on the paper. So you should take a listen to this music. So here we mapped all of that, and here you'll see pixels in purple are those that are high on both biodiversity, and we're calling it institutionalized cultural richness because it's the cultural diversity that got adopted by the UNESCO, for example, and cultures like the campesinos are not mapped because we don't have the maps for them or the data for them in the same way as we have for indigenous or Afro-Colombian people. But here you see areas around the Caribbean, the Amazon, Orinoquia, and Pacific as high biodiversity, biocultural rich places. In blue are those that are high on culture, and red that are high on biodiversity. So we see the Andes, for example, showing up as more of a biodiversity place, and areas along the Pacific as more cultural, but the purple are the ones that are biocultural. And so what are some of these places? So the Afro-Colombian people live along the Pacific coast, but it's also the territory of the golden poison frogs, the long-wattled umbrella birds. So we see that these territories have both lots of cultural richness and biodiversity. In the Orinoquia, for example, we have the Sicuani indigenous peoples, and then we have South American tapirs and Orinoco peacock bass, and lots of stuff happening on these places. But if we look at one municipality here, Valledupar, for example, this is an illustration of what's happening in Valledupar, right? Here you have everything. You have river, you have mountains, you have tropical dry forests, you have the Sierra Nevada of Santa Marta, which is one of the most irreplaceable places on Earth in terms of endemic species richness. It's also the place of the ancestral knowledge systems of the Arhuaco, Kogi, Wiwa, and Canquamo indigenous peoples, which is in UNESCO's intangible cultural heritage of humanity. It is also a place of the Festival de la Leyenda Vallenata, an international music festival. So here you see vallenatos, and it's territory of Afro-Colombian communities and lots of museums. So this is, if you zoom into those territories, this is what we have, right, on these biocultural places. And this one, Ivan, this one is for you. If I map by every jurisdiction, so this is Afro-Colombian lands, indigenous areas, and protected areas. Just looking at the birds, just not to confuse you, of all species richness, we see that average value of indigenous reserves and Afro-Colombian territories have higher avian species richness than protected areas. We also see that Afro-Colombian territories have higher richness of threatened bird species, but that protected areas have higher richness of endemic species of birds. So it's not such easy conversation with the governance. And I acknowledge that these slides do not have spatial matching, like difference of difference. So if you're an economist and knows how to do these methods, let me know so we can make the next round of analysis. And in terms of tourism, so to complement, I told you how I did biocultural diversity, but then for tourism, we think a lot about the push and pull factors. So what brings people to a location are all these things: cultural heritage, biodiversity. But what pushes people out of a location is, if there's no hotels, if there's safety concerns, if there diseases, difficult aspects for hotels. So we try to do this. And first we map the biodiversity richness, which it's here with fishes, birds, mammals, ecosystems. Then we mapped institutional cultural richness with all these variables to create the biocultural diversity map that I showed you. But for the tourism analysis, I also created a layer of accessibility, mapping closeness to airports, hotels, bird watching lodges, reversing the conflict densities and thinking about the proximity of how close it is to the main city to create a tourism potential index. So where are places that have supply of biocultural diversity, but that are also accessible, right? And then thinking about demand, we thought a lot about eBirds, so places where bird watchers are going, where sports fisheries is happening, airports arrivals, music festival visitors, and national park visitors. And then I subtracted demand and supply. So where are the places that could have more tourists because they have all the conditions for tourism, but people are not going there, or where more tourists going, but with this biocultural approach, this is a mismatch. So I'll show you the mismatch. The first question is Colombia safeguarding the areas with the highest potential for biocultural tourism development? So here in dark green, you'll see areas that have more biocultural supply than demand, right? So these are places along the Pacific, along the Amazon, or Kia, where we see all of these things are happening. They're accessible areas, they are biocultural, and these are places like municipalities like Miriti, Paraná, or Barbacoas. And in brown, you see areas that there are more tourists going there, but for other reasons that is not biocultural diversity. So these are cities like Medellin. Medellin, yes, it has lots of biocultural diversity, but not in the way I am thinking about it, right? So we see more people going there. And so to conclude, biodiversity governance in Colombia is rich and complex with many actors, instruments, and themes. Cultural diversity and biodiversity are correlated in some areas, but not everywhere. Ecotourism supply and demand vary spatially across the country. Biocultural diversity can be mainstream in sustainable tourism, but this depends on whether the local communities want to do this or not. And it's up to all of us to work with policymakers, decision makers, with indigenous peoples and local communities to see these positive changes that we want to see in how we steward our planet. And with that, I want to end by saying that my lab just opened. It focuses on conserving wildlife and human cultures. It's in Berkeley, and I'm recruiting postdocs and PhD students for the fall. So please, if you're interested in this, talk to me. And thank you. With that, I end.